I'd like to start with the word crisis, because really it should be crises in the plural. There's the economically driven crisis of the humanities / the study of literature. We can talk about this distinction. There's the crisis of legitimation among professors of literature. There's the cost of education in America. There's the growing precariousness of the middle class. I suppose the first question is, am I missing any crises? And can you tell us more about this multivarious crisis?
Right. I would maybe even rephrase your first question, Alice, and say, is crisis or crises a useful term for us to be using? And I say this in part because I just changed the subtitle of the book. It is no longer literature, professionalism, and the crisis of the humanities. It's post-discipline, 2 paths for the future of literary study. And one of the reasons I did that is because I think this term crisis is quite overused. It seems to indicate a point of decision-making, a potential turning point. And I think in doing that, it sometimes obscures what are much longer historical trends, some of which your various crises put into interrelation in really interesting ways. So I'm trying to think about what order to take your crises in. The first one that you mentioned that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is what goes by the name of the crisis of the humanities. And what people mean when they say that is usually that there have been funding cuts to the humanities, either at the level of the nation, the individual states, or within private institutions. Money has been diverted away from various humanistic subjects towards other subjects that appear to be, in a kind of utilitarian calculus, more useful, particularly for, say, undergraduate students. And then there's a separate kind of crisis of the humanities that people talk about, I think, when they're talking about graduate education. And that would be what goes by the name of the crisis of the job market. And that is simply that there is an oversupply of PhD students for the demand for tenure track assistant professors. And I'm disintegrating these because I think one of the mistakes that people make when they talk about the landscape of higher education, and particularly what's happening in the humanities, or let's say in literary study, is not to disentangle what's happening at the undergraduate level from what's happening at the graduate level, because those two things I think need to be discussed separately from one another. The second crisis that you mentioned, the crisis of legitimation, that's a phrase that you're taking from John Guillory's new book, Professing Criticism. And that is much more specific, I think, to the study of literature at a graduate level, which is, why is it that anybody would need to become a professional literary critic? What is it that the formation of a professional literary critic offers to the world? What is its value? And should we even be talking about it in terms of value? So that's another set of questions that I think maps on to graduate education, but is probably a little bit less important for undergraduate education in the US. I can keep going, but I don't want to just kind of lecture about crises and why we ought to or not to be using that term. So I'll pause there and let you ask a question.
Well, I suppose another distinction to be made, and you make this point, is so we talked about the US and then the UK, but also there's a sense of the crisis is, if we want to call it crisis, looks differently in different countries. And so maybe you can talk about that too, because you studied as an undergraduate in the US, you did your PhD in the US, but then you had a career in Canada and then the UK, and now you're back in America, but you also understand other contexts. So maybe you could talk about the non-Anglo-American context and that context.
Well, I think first maybe what I'll just point to, because it's probably the context that people here are most familiar with, is that there is an important difference between the Anglo and the American. And it's very difficult to talk about these questions of higher education without talking about the educational system more generally. So one of the really interesting things that I noticed when I was in the UK was that the entire system of education is different from the primary to the secondary to the tertiary level, from what the system of education is in the US. I could say the same thing of Turkey, which is where I was born. I could say the same thing of Germany, where my family lived for a year and my children went to a kita, that you can't really talk about, it is a mistake to talk about university education as something that is separate from the entire structure of higher education, of education, sorry. And to just give you a really obvious example of this from my own teaching and probably from your experience as well, it makes a huge difference that in the UK, students choose what they are going to study in college before they get to college. In Turkey, where my mother did her, where she went to school and did her training, they would take an exam at the age of 12 that would determine what it was that they were going to study, which would then determine what their profession was going to be for the rest of their lives. So that kind of professional specialization happens at different levels in different countries. And it has a significant impact on what you think education is for, what your ideology of education is. So if you are in the kind of, let's say, typical American system, an idealized one in which there are no book bans, for instance, or any of the other kind of terrible things that are happening via conservative legislatures right now. In the typical American system, a student would study a wide range of subjects in elementary school, middle school, high school. They would go to college, they would take 1.5, 2 years of courses, and then they would choose what it was that they wanted to study. In the UK, as you know, or at a place like Oxford, they apply to study in a particular subject, and then they only study in that subject in the 3 years that they are in university. And that produces a wildly different kind of student. The kind of student who has a generalist education and then chooses versus the kind of student who has already chosen to specialize. And it means that they have very different ideas about what the purpose of college is. I feel like in the US, the language of self-actualization, of self-discovery, of choice is much more dominant than it is in the UK. And we could argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing on balance. I'm just observing that it makes for highly different national cultural settings.
I mean, we could talk about the purpose and then we could also talk about the cost. Because
yes,
while, of course, the UK system is much more expensive than it used to be, it's much less expensive than the American system, which radically changes everything.
And my first job was at McGill in Montreal, where a student could go and get a fantastic college education at a place like McGill for $12,000 total over all 4 years. And that meant that the student population that you were serving was wildly different from the student population that you are encountering at a place like Oxford or any other UK university, or at a place like, of course, Harvard, Yale, Wesleyan, et cetera, et cetera. So the student population at a place like McGill, because of the cost, was so much more diverse, but also because of the cost, I felt like there wasn't the same anxiety among students of, should I major in a discipline or in a field that doesn't appear to have any obvious social value? They were not having the same kinds of conversations about what does it mean for me to be $100,000 in debt and majoring in English. So one of the great, benefits, of course, of making an education affordable is that it takes some of the pressure off of, if I can use the term, the other crises that we are talking about. Once education is affordable for the vast majority of people in a country or in places where education is free, then I don't think you have exactly the same set of anxieties. I'm not saying they disappear entirely, but they are significantly lessened. And to me, it's really impossible to, I have a very hard time seeing how US higher education can continue at the cost that it is currently at, in part just because of what's happening with the student debt bubble.
I want to slightly turn the conversation now to go to the study of literature, because you talked about specialization, and I want to talk about professionalization. And before we turn to arguments you make in your book about how outside the departments of literature, literary study is kind of alive and well, I think we can look to the past, and you make this point, other people have made this point, that the study of literature is very old, but the professionalization of the study of literature is quite young. Can you talk about the recent history of the study of literature.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think so. The two books that I would say make this point really brilliantly, and that I would recommend to anybody interested in it. The first is Gerald Graff's book from 1987. It's called Professing Literature, and then John Guillory's recent book from 2022, Professing Criticism. And I think Guillory, more than Graff, is interested in the sheer weirdness of how the study of literature has developed. And also its youthfulness, which is to say it's really only in its current form sort of 60 or 70 years old, which I still consider youthful. So the youthfulness of it. And I think that one of the things that feels very heartening about that is that nothing is set in stone. Everything can change. So what looks to us like the kind of natural order of literary study, whereby as an undergraduate, you go to college, you major in literature, you study various historical areas, various national areas that are mapped onto those historical areas. If you want to be a professional literary scholar, you then go on to graduate school, you take oral exams or comps, you write a dissertation. All of that is shockingly new. And the reason why it's structured the way that it is links up with all sorts of other larger kinds of socioeconomic concerns, some of which we've been talking about: the place of the university as an institution in the larger landscape of a nation state, the ideology of education, why it is that we want to be educated, what it is that we want our education to do for us. And I think once you realize that, it makes, I mean, I think this is what happens every time you historicize anything. It makes new future possibilities feel more open, because if all of this is new, then all of it can change. And there are parts of it we might not want to change, and there are parts of it that we might very much want to change.
Yeah, and we'll talk about those parts specifically. And I think it's curious because it is new. On the other hand, it has gone through various kind of iterations. So these are kind of technical terms that maybe you have all heard of, but I'd love for you to speak to them. So there's the philologists, literary historians, belletristes, scholar critics. Can you talk about how these kind of iterations fit into this maybe longer history?
Maybe I will just dial down the technical vocabulary by like 1 degree and say that I think one way you can interestingly map the history of literary study, and this is what Gerald Graff does in his book, is as a kind of battle between generalists and specialists. So generalists being the kinds of people or the kinds of movements that believe in not only a kind of universal rationale for why it is that we study literature, but also generally have a commitment to linking up quite explicitly the study of literature in institutional settings with the movement or the circulation of literature in the world beyond those institutions. And I would say maybe the most recent iteration of the generalist, which I think, whether the generalist and the specialist are totally separate, or if you can be both, is a question I'll come back to. But one of the more recent iteration of the generalist might be people like me or like Luc Menand, who have university positions but are trying to make complicated scholarly ideas accessible in magazines like The New Yorker or the New York Review of Books. And of course, that also requires a kind of specialization. You have to have a kind of expert knowledge in order to be able to figure out how to make it palatable or attractive to a larger audience, which is where that division gets a bit complicated. And then, the specialists, or the longer kind of history of specialization, has to do with the kind of importation of a German model of higher education into an American setting at the turn of the 20th century. And the shift from having professors who were largely kind of, teaching professors who moved often around various departments, to having what were then called investigators, people who had a particular research problem and wanted to find a solution to whatever they identified as the problem, people who had a paradigm with which they approached the production of knowledge. And it seems to me that, without getting into exactly all of the movements, one way we could map the history of literary study is as a constant pull and push, or a tug of war between the generalists and the specialists. And each kind of scholar emerging at different moments in history based on what the needs of the institution of higher education were, and how higher education was, or what the role of higher education seemed to be within society.
And is it possible to be both?
Well, yeah, I mean, I
given,
think
given that you specialize, I mean,
right.
Writing a PhD is a type of specialization. Given that you're now a generalist, as you say, how is it? How do you reconcile that for yourself, and how do you see other people who want to do this reconciling with it?
So I think this is where I would be a little bit more specific about how we think about being a specialist. So one way you can think about being a specialist is about being a scholar who works on a particular historical period in a particular national setting. And, you know, when I was in graduate school, at least, that's how many jobs were advertised. People were looking for, say, a British modernist, which is looking for someone who works on literature produced in a certain historical context. I think you can also think about specialization now the way that I think about it, which is specializing in a genre. So people who work on the lyric, people who work on the novel, people who work on performance studies or on theater. And then you have a specialty, but it's a specialty that allows for a more kind of transhistorical and transnational sweep to it. And to my mind, those are the specialists who become the best generalists, because if you can specialize in a genre, then you can think historically about how that genre operates over time. And if you get a particular object as an example of that genre, you can figure out what other objects like it is in conversation with. And that seems to me the way of organizing literary studies, such that the specialist and the generalist come into closer contact with one another than, say, organizing it around, you know, literature in English written in England from 1830 to 1910, or literature in English in England written from 1910 to the present, which is how courses at Oxford were the undergraduate offering in English. That's how it was structured. And so you would end up with just a kind of hodgepodge of historical artifacts, but not without a kind of formal or an aesthetic rationale linking them together.
And of course, if you're in academia, you're thinking about specialization, but you're also thinking about professionalization. And there's this kind of slippage, and this would, to a French audience or French-speaking audience, there's this almost joke, which is lovely. This idea of the professional formation is actually the deformation. Can you talk the deformation of the profession? Yeah.
Oh, right. So that's a line that you're taking from Guillory's new book, Professing Criticism. I mean, one question I think that I'm always wondering, and that I think anyone who identifies as a professional is wondering, is what does it mean to be a professional? On some very basic level, it means that you have the credentials to do something that other people cannot do. You cannot be, for instance, an amateur doctor, or I don't think you can be, or I think you'll probably go to jail if you operate as an amateur doctor. I don't think you can be an amateur lawyer. You can probably be an amateur literary critic, and that's an interesting way in which what we do is perhaps distinct and invites questions about professionalization at a more intense level. But on a very basic level, being part of a profession is having a certain set of credentials that allow you to access forms of work that other people cannot access, that people without those credentials cannot access. So that's one understanding of what it means to be a professional. Another understanding of what it means to be a professional might be to say that in the course of acquiring those credentials, you take on certain personality traits, certain ways of perceiving the world or of being in the world, what the great French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu would call a habitus, right? You assume a particular habitus as a result of your professional training. And that habitus makes you keenly aware of certain things, and it makes you unaware of or a little bit unresponsive to certain other things. I have a father who is a surgeon, and the habitus of the surgeon, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this kind of stereotype, right? Long hours, sort of intense self-control, quasi-dictatorial way of managing an operating room, and a real allergy to emotion.
Is he a generalist or a specialist?
He's a specialist. He's a liver transplant surgeon. So he's a very.
What is that kind of habitus? What's that habitus?
Yeah, that. Well, I just told you, right? I'm telling you. I mean, I should be lying down if I'm talking to you about my daddy issues. But, right. So a kind of intense commitment to discipline, to a sort of stoicism, and a disregard for feeling. Right. I love my father, by the way. So if he's on Zoom, and one could say the exact same thing about being a professional literary critic, that to go through a PhD program, to be an assistant professor, an associate professor, a full professor, to understand the study of literature as a profession that is delimited by a certain set of credentials, promotes in you certain forms of extraordinary mastery, and it makes you unaware of other things that are happening. And may I give an example from my own? So last year I was one of the judges for the International Booker Prize, which was really the most rewarding reading experience of my entire life. And one of the things that I became aware of was that there is an incredibly vibrant community of bookstagrammers and book talk influencers whose specialty is translated literature. And the way that they produce criticism about translated literature is to make these kind of long YouTube videos where they do perform orally what I would call close readings. And they keep blogs and they have communities. And that this is a way of engaging with literature that I at least was not aware of. And it had not, occurred to me. I think when you are teaching in a university setting, you often think of your primary audience as 18 to 21-year-olds and 2, your colleagues in the profession. And I thought, but here is a whole other public that has a whole different set of protocols for how they circulate their objects, for how they produce commentary on their objects. They have a whole different understanding of what the relationship is between, say, knowledge and emotion about their objects. And I would never have encountered that had it not been for this very particular experience that clued me into it. And so to me, it made a particular aspect of my professional deformation really visible, which was that generally my sense of my audience is limited to the kinds of students that I encounter in the classroom and to the kinds of people that I believe will be reading the articles that I publish in scholarly journals. But of course, there's a much wider world of literature. I mean, this library is an example of that. What you're doing with this programming more generally is an example of that. But it's not necessarily something that I would have been clued into had I not been operating in these other ways.
Yeah, and you describe it really beautifully, or also kind of funnily in your article, has academia ruined literary criticism?
I didn't choose that. But yeah.
We can see that.
I asked them not to use that because I said, you will get me in trouble if you use that. But as a common thing that is said at the New Yorker nowadays is that it's very lucrative to irritate the, quote, MLA people. You get a lot more traffic to the site if you do.
We'll turn to audience questions. You see that you can really ask anything and get an open response.
You can't ask about my mother, yeah.
But you write, so this is kind of deformation of academia writ large, and you say, today in academe, one looks around with dismay at what a century of professionalization has wrought. The mastery, yes, but also the bureaucratic pettiness, the clumsily concealed resentment, the quickness to take offense, and the piety, oh, the piety. Can you talk about, so there's this...
Do you want that on a t-shirt or a tote bag?
The piety, oh,
the piety, yeah.
Can you talk about also your experience of the deformation of academia more generally? I mean, you talked about it specifically in this instance, but your experience of being in the world of academia for a while now.
Well, I mean, the first thing that I would say that I don't think I stressed sufficiently in that line is the mastery, right? I mean, the mastery point is completely overwhelmed by the little jabs that come after it. And by the way, the essay is at all points making reference to Virginia Woolf's great essay, How It Strikes a Contemporary, which is her account of the decline of criticism. And I feel like some of these funnier moments were tips of the hat to Woolf that perhaps were not legible as such. But I'll start by just stressing that mastery, right? Which is that one of the things that I think the ability, or one of the things that I think the experience of being a professional literary scholar allows you is the time to think very deeply and to read relatively widely. And that produces a base of knowledge that I think it is largely impossible to acquire without that kind of professional training. I mean, the autodidact is a fascinating figure to us, but it's precisely because the autodidact is so rare. The only way to get that kind of expansive, careful base of knowledge, I think, is to be a professional scholar. So that is just one thing that I would stress, that you become well-versed in a really wide range of objects. And I think that that is extremely important. So that's the kind of mastery part that I really want to stress. And then that mastery gets interestingly laced with various kinds of professional considerations. So for instance, when you write a journal article, you have to be in conversation with a question or a research paradigm that is interesting to other people, that other people have written about. This wasn't always the case. There was a time when you could write entire books that were just chapter by chapter, extremely kind of elegant and deep readings of, and by deep, I don't mean the way sometimes literary scholars use that, as deep versus surface level. I mean sort of long and penetrating analyses of individual novels. But you can only have so many of those, right? You can only produce so many kind of holistic accounts of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. As the profession becomes more professionalized, as it becomes more standardized, as it becomes more bureaucratized, what you see are people speaking with one another about things that have been written prior to whatever the pieces that they were writing. And so what might seem to you like at its core a kind of elegant and acute reading of a novel has to be scaffolded with the professional language of other literary critics. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't know. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But what seems undeniable to me is that professionalization imposes a kind of framework on writing. And that writing that is to be recognized by the profession, i.e. that is to be published, has to trade or has to partake in those conventions. So that's just one example. I realize I'm not touching on the pettiness, the jealousy, the clumsily concealed resentment. I'm not.
We'll rise
that,
above. We'll rise gracefully above the pettiness. We won't engage with the pettiness. I want to bring this specific point back to the present day and to your book, Post-Discipline, because while this is kind of going on in the study of literature, you make this point. I haven't read the book, but you've written about it and talked about it, that the skills of the humanities, that the study of literature is finding its way out of the discipline. You talked about TikTok and Instagram and BookTok, etc. But also you make the point that it's finding its way into schools of business, medicine, law. Why has this happened? And can you tell us about what you call, I love this, the leader as reader and the carer as reader?
Yeah, so, when I was on the job market the first time, which was I think in 2015 or 2016, I had an ex-boyfriend who had gone to business school. And he said, well, if you can't get a job as a professor at a university, you can always go teach literature at a business school. And I said, what are you talking about? And he linked me to this course that he had taken at Stanford called Moral Leadership Through Literature, and sent me the syllabus. And I thought that this was fascinating to me. I thought, why are these business school students reading novels? What is it that they're getting from them? How are they reading them? What does the way that they're reading them have to do with the case history as the genre of the business school? And once I started looking, and actually I ended up doing a whole kind of digital humanities project on this. Once I started looking at this in a more systematic way, it turned out that almost every business school, every medical school, and every law school in the US and increasingly in the UK has some kind of a literature course where they are using mostly novels, although sometimes poems and sometimes plays, in order to supplement part of their professional training that they feel like they are not getting through their own established curricula and syllabi. And I thought, well, this is fascinating that at the very moment we seem to be committed to a kind of declinist narrative of literary study in the undergraduate, in undergraduate settings, but then also in graduate school in various ways, that the study of literature is actually flourishing in these other professional schools. And to me, they seem to be a kind of through the mirror darkly version of some other places where literature is flourishing, which include not only Book Talk or Instagram or whatever, but also things like prison literacy initiatives, or what some of the smaller liberal arts colleges are instituting now, which are micro colleges, where you go to community centers or to public libraries and you offer literature courses so that people who are, often single mothers, members of the working class can go get a college education without having to, go to Bard, for instance, in order to get that education and without having to pay the same amounts of money. So the professional school version of this seemed to me like the mirror image of the attempt to reach out to working class students, the incarcerated and the impoverished. And it seemed interesting to me that both of these phenomena were taking place at the same time, and that they gave us a much broader understanding of what the field of literary study was and what it could be than just looking at the undergraduate classroom or looking at the graduate classroom. The leader as reader is the habitus, let's say, of the business school professional who reads literature in order to learn how to become an effective leader. And one of the things that it links up to is this large, is the massive proliferation of words like narrative and storytelling in culture today, right? That part of what business leaders are supposed to do is be storytellers, and that they're supposed to be persuasive orators who give their followers a story that they can latch onto, that they can accept, so that they will do what the leader wants them to do.
So what is the leader as reader reading?
It's a really wide range of things. So it's everything from kind of bad examples of leadership, for instance, King Lear, to my favorite, and the chapter on this in the book turns on a reading of Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day, that is very influenced by these kind of 1970s, 1980s discourse of the servant leader. That part of what being a leader is giving yourself over to or serving your followers. And that links up, interestingly, with certain kinds of religious discourses, but it also links up with the general idea of customer service as being part of what the leader is providing. And Mark McGurl has written a fascinating book on Amazon and Jeff Bezos, and Bezos' reading of Kazuo Ishiguro as being part of the motivating force behind Amazon's ideology of customer service. So I encourage everybody to read that. But my chapter is trying to show where that all comes from, which is this much more systematic appropriation of certain kinds of cultural objects. But appropriation isn't the right word, but this movement of certain kinds of cultural objects into places where we wouldn't expect to find them. So it's really wide range of things that they're
And you have to forgive me, but to bring your father back into the conversation.
Please, yes. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. What would he make of the carer as reader? And
oh no, he's the wrong right. That's interesting, because my father now feels that ever since medical schools became like attentive of people's feelings, they've really all gone downhill. He thinks ever since they did things like set limits on how many hours a week doctors could work, like he doesn't believe in an 80-hour work week maximum, because this was a person who worked 135 hours a week when I was growing up. So he would very much poo-poo the carer as reader, but the carer as reader links up to another kind of growth area, let's say, of literary study, which is the medical humanities. Okay, so the medical humanities is one of the massive growth areas of literary study. It's an area that is, I think, very recently, let's say in the last decade or so, gained a kind of legibility as a field of research unto itself. And it's a pedagogical program that many, many medical students are asked to participate in, or doctors are asked to participate in one way or another. And it tends to revolve around the idea of empathic communion between a patient and a doctor, that stories somehow, again, that word storytelling, that narrative somehow give us the ability to do things like take a patient case history in a more attentive way, such that we can be better caring professionals. And again, it's really interesting to me, these professional situations that are fundamentally dependent on something like the case, the business school case, the patient case, and that are trying to overlay literature or a certain idea of literature onto the genre of the case and the case history.
Yes, you use medical humanities, and you just a couple of minutes ago used digital humanities. And for you, both of these are symptoms, this post-disciplinarity are symptoms of how the world has absorbed the pressures of a connectionist world. Can you talk about this word and what does it mean, and how was this kind of symptomatic of it?
Right. So I'll say something slightly broader first, and
it's
then
very
I'll get,
technical.
and then I'll
sorry
get,
to bring it up.
It's okay. I'll give you the kind of technical background, which is that one of the larger things that my book is interested in is this shift to interdisciplinarity and all of the rhetoric that surrounds that. Interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, de-disciplining, undisciplining our disciplines. And part of the question I have is, why are we in this moment where all of a sudden disciplinarity is so suspect, or it seems like it's something that needs to be exceeded? What is that registering in the world at large? And in order to answer that question, I turn to this again to two French sociologists, Luc Boltanski and Eve Chiapello, who wrote a fantastic book some of you might know called The New Spirit of Capitalism, in which they talk about how after 1968 and after the kind of failures of radical action in 1968, one of the things that the bourgeois became very good at doing was absorbing the artistic critique of capital, while kind of ignoring the materialist critique of capital. So all kinds of bourgeois institutions became extremely good at promising flexibility, creativity, self-actualization, right? All of the things we think that capital and its movement and its manifestation in work stymies. But all of a sudden, your workplace became a place where you could self-actualize. It became a place where you could be flexible. It became a place where you could think creatively, where you could, as we were discussing just a moment earlier, generate narratives and tell stories with your teammates. And one way that Chiapello and Boltanski describe this kind of general shift in the ideology of capital is as the shift from a kind of bureaucratic and hierarchical world to a connectionist world. And it's in part ideological, people using the language of flexibility, of connectivity, of distributing their social and their informational capital, of networking, all of these things, and of doing so in ways that make them visible to us as empathic, communicative, completely human creatures, as opposed to drones, right? Robotic drones, yeah. And the other way is that, you know, there actually are more kind of there's more casualized labor. Labor moves more quickly from one place of work to another. A lot of the kinds of projects that are taken on are short-term projects. Connections between people are built up and then torn down and then built up again. So there's both a kind of ideological and a material component to the connectionist world as they describe it. And part of the argument I want to make is that as those skills become more important, these professional schools, which previously generated surgeons like my father, suddenly realize that you need to create these communicative, empathic, human creatures. And literature is tasked with doing the work, the connectionist work that makes all professionals right now good professionals or functional professionals, high functioning professionals. And so these, you know, poor, obsolete surgeons have to, you know, complain about an 80-hour work week. Yeah.
I'm looking at the time. And
sorry.
No. What I want to do before we turn to audience questions is just ask about the second half of your book. And again, this is the general gist of how I understand it based on this interview that you gave about it. Can you talk about the importance of judgment and the practice of judgment in the second part of your book, and why and how it might become available to all, and how it might be a social good? Or maybe your arguments changed since you gave the interview.
Well, maybe I'll frame it a little bit differently and say that the reason I decided to change the title of the book to Two Paths for Literary Study is because I think the path that I just described, the leader as reader, the carer as reader, that's a path that I think people imagine will scale in a particular way. That everybody wants to be a leader nowadays, right? Even my kids go to a progressive school now in the US, which is very different from the school they went to in the UK, but like the central ideology of their school is being a good leader. Everyone wants to be a good leader. It's completely trickled down the educational system.
And your children are 5 and 7?
They're 5 and 7. Everybody caring,
leading Lego
the
cleanup.
Lead, exactly. You know, the ideology of care is another thing that I think has completely diffused through the educational system. And so that is a model of literary study where literary study can scale, right? There is immense potential for how many people it can reach, especially as a university education becomes increasingly the privilege of it's already the privilege of the professional managerial class, but as the cost of education continues to rise, that becomes ever more true, right? So that's one version of it. I think one question we don't often ask is, does it need to scale? You and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, because so much of the conversation around crisis is driven by a focus on graduate education and on this supply-demand imbalance. I think we've gotten used to thinking that what we need to do is produce more and more jobs so that everybody can be employed, which is a good thing, right? I don't think that means we need to produce more and more English majors necessarily. And so the question of how much would be enough is not a question that we often engage with. And I sometimes wonder, what if it didn't scale? So what if literary study wasn't so preoccupied with receiving or with attaining a sort of fantasy maximum number of enrollments? What would it look like? What would we allow ourselves to do if we weren't so worried about attracting students? And this is, an interesting question coming from a place like Oxford, where at Oxford colleges, we would admit our own students. For each college, you only admitted between 8 and 12. There was never an enrollment problem exactly. And so what that freed you up to do was then teach in ways that probably look extremely conservative to American undergraduate educators. And so the second half of the book asks, if we weren't so concerned about scale, what might the literary curriculum look like? And also, what might it look like if we were to reintegrate parts of literary study that have since its professionalization in the 40s, 50s, were expelled from the discipline? So what happens if we teach craft along with teaching knowledge? What happens if we teach composition and literature together, as opposed to outsourcing the teaching of composition to teachers who are usually less well paid, who have less job security, while the people who get to teach literature are the professors, right, as opposed to the adjuncts? What would happen if foreign language education were as important as modern literature? What would happen if you had to teach across all these different levels of the curriculum, no matter what your rank was? And what would happen too if criticism, by which I mean something different from scholarship, what would happen if criticism were something that we actually taught students how to write? And if judgment, i.e. making judgments of different kinds of cultural objects, were something that we could standardize or that we could educate people in doing? Because my experience, at least as a critic at places like the New Yorker or the New York Review, is that nobody teaches you how to write in that genre. That is a kind of on-the-job training that you get, and that you're largely teaching yourself. And one of the things I'm interested in doing at the center that I'm now the director of is figuring out how you can actually teach people to write criticism, as opposed to hoping they teach themselves based on examples.
Well, so this is going to be my next question, which is that you just use a lot of what ifs, and yet you are the director of the Superior Center. So how concretely are you doing it? And what challenges are you coming up against, and how are you fitting in these kind of lofty ideals to the practicalities of a 9 to 5, 8 to, I'm trying to think the latest class, 8 to 10 school day?
Well, I mean, what I'm really trying to design is a kind of minor or a major in criticism that would be different from, say, majoring in English. Because when you major in English, the kinds of papers that you're writing are for nobody other than for your teachers, right? You're writing your papers, yes, in order to practice thinking and to practice argument, and sometimes to even practice writing. But you are writing to an audience, largely to an audience of one, and that is the person who is assessing you. What if we, I'm sorry, I'm saying what if again. What I propose is that we design a minor or a major in which that is not the central assumption, in which you are writing for an audience that is larger than that audience of one. Who exactly that audience is, I think differs based on what genre of criticism you're writing in, based on what kind of publication you're writing it in. But I think the basic assumption would be that you would be writing things or producing things orally in order to be published, in order to be listened to, in order to circulate, as opposed to go to your teacher and stay with your teacher. So my sense of how to do that is that you have to do two separate things. One, you need to give people a kind of in-depth historical and theoretical understanding of what criticism is. And for that, you need a kind of history of criticism course that starts, say, from the 17th century and goes up to the present and teaches people what has come before them, because I think it's always important to know what has come before you in order to know what you want to do in the future. It would involve a course on theories of judgment. How is it that we like what we like? How is it that we persuade other people to like the things that we do? And maybe not even liking, but hating or categorizing. So if you read something by Beckett and say it's a comedy, and I read something and say it's a tragicomedy, what is at stake in that kind of distinction? And how might we each persuade an audience that our distinction is the distinction that would allow them to see the object as it is most clearly? And then I think a class on the history of media and media forms, because in order to know what kind of criticism you want to write or how to write criticism, you have to understand how it circulates. So that's on the kind of historical and theoretical side. And then I think on the more practical side, I think of criticism in terms of genres. And the first kind of split that happens in my mind is between genres of oral criticism and genres of written criticism. So what you and I are doing here is, I think, a form of oral criticism. An interview is a form of oral criticism. We are not judging an object together, although we could be, and perhaps we are kind of judging something like professional literary study, but we are generating knowledge together. And the question of how to do that, how to be a good interviewer or how to be a good conversationalist such that you can generate knowledge with another person is, I think, something that can be taught and should be taught. The same way that I think you can teach someone how to do an art crit, or you can teach someone how to give a public lecture, or you can teach someone how to run a creative writing workshop, such that they're not just asking the other students to comment on what they liked and what they didn't like. These are all situations in which the potential for oral criticism exists, but they're not standardized in any way. And then written criticism is much more like what I think I do on a regular basis. And again, that also breaks up into different genres. So the review essay of 900 to 1200 words is a different beast than the review of 900 to 1200 words is different from the review essay of 3500 to 5000 words, which is different from a piece of biographical criticism where you take a person's entire life and work into account, which is different from an anniversary essay on the centenary of Ulysses or the wasteland or what have you, which is different from a thematic piece on the personal essay or on autofiction or whatever. And all of these have different conventions, and they all involve looking at and putting objects into conversation with one another in different kinds of ways. But again, I don't think this is something anybody teaches. And I would like to teach it because I think it's one way. Well, I mean, I would like to teach it because I think what I learned from judging the Booker and from having this, experience with other reading publics is that the kinds of technologies and the kinds of platforms that we have at our disposal make it possible for many, many, many people to produce commentary on the objects that are made. And I'm interested in what one can do to help that commentary be as effective and as elegant and as perceptive as possible.
This will be my last question. So
Yeah.
in this case, it's a question of scale.
Yeah. So I think what I'm suggesting is that I can get at, I think I'm saying I can have my cake and eat it too, which is that I can have both scale and I can have a certain set of highly systematized practices that produce both craft and knowledge. And I think I can do that at a scale that, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily make everyone good at it because there's no accounting for certain kinds of idiosyncrasies, but I think it would give everybody the ability to do it. And of course, not just by having a program, right, where that only serves particular students, but by taking something like this program and turning it into a book or a guide or something that was much more readily accessible.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Alice. That's a great question.
Can we have a round of applause, please,
Oh,
for Merve? Thank you. Thank you. So we have about 10 or so minutes for questions.
We were only supposed to speak for 40.
Well,
I went on and on and on.
It's absolutely
Joanna.
fine.
Hi.
Yes, and I'll refer you to Alfonso, who's got the microphone.
Thank you so much. I could ask you so many things. One question I had in the description of your program and also related to this question of scale, I'm curious how you see MFA programs, creative writing programs fitting in, because that is something that is proliferating. I mean, in the US, it's enormous. It's proliferating in the UK and kind of taking a lot of this. One of the things that English professors lament is that people who would have majored in English are now majoring in creative writing, and they want to write without reading is sort of the complaint, but I don't know how cranky that is. But it does seem to me that what you're looking at is asking sort of English students to look at contemporary cultural production, which in an English program you very rarely do. You look at old things, you don't look at current things, and you certainly don't look at things that are being created in by your peers on the other side of the quad or whatever, as I remember thinking was very strange. But yeah, so I just wonder how you think create.
Can I tell a story that will make me enemies? Not here, but yeah, okay, I'll go ahead. I taught this genres of criticism class for the first time in the Columbia MFA program as a master class. And there were two really interesting things that came out of that for me. The first was that the students all came up afterwards and they were like, this is the most rigorous course we've ever taken. It was for 5 days and the last day was a pizza party. So just to give you a sense of, what I think is happening in MFA programs, which is that I think often they are paying lots of very well-established writers a lot of money to kind of phone it in. And I think that oftentimes the labor of producing criticism in the MFA program is being outsourced to other students, which I think is fine and one way to do it. The workshop model is one way to do it. But I think to hear students say that they had not before encountered a kind of technical or systematic vocabulary of how to produce a piece of work in a particular genre was truly shocking to me. So that's one thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that when I was teaching in that program, I think the students were largely split between students who had majored in creative writing as undergraduates and students who had majored in a subject area. And the creative writing students had a much more cultivated vocabulary of craft and of technique. And the ones who had majored in a subject area had much more robust ideas. And so my thought was like, of course, these two things need to be taught together. And so when I describe a kind of minor in criticism, I think the idea is that it would always be paired with some kind of subject area, whether that is English literature, whether it's modern literature, whether it's film, whether it's art history. And that in part, what you're doing is allowing the kind of disciplinary subject area to give people something like historical range and a sense of debates, say, within a particular discipline. And then what criticism is doing is teaching them how to take that understanding and shape it into both a beautiful artifact, a pleasurable artifact, and an artifact that circulates as knowledge among a distinctive public. So I don't think it could ever exist without a subject area. And I think that is actually what the rise of creative writing programs teaches us, that those programs should always be integrated with English departments without taking over English departments. I mean, that's also the other kind of a more kind of micro level crisis that we didn't talk about, right, is that often it's creative writing enrollments that are floating English departments right now. And the enrollment declines are happening in literature classes, not in creative writing classes. And I don't think the answer to that is to say, well, let's make all of our assignments creative, because I think you're then doing doing a disservice to students, but also two, I think there is a way that you can teach creative writing, and I don't know that English professors necessarily know how to teach it. They know how to teach a kind of argumentative essay, but a creative piece is an entirely different species, right? The same way criticism in its various genres and subgenres is a different kind of species. So I think everything I'm saying is that there should be a much more integrated version of a humanities education. And that, the genres of criticism class for me was one place where I could see how it could happen in a way that didn't require kind of retooling all English departments so that everybody was both a professor of literature and a creative writer. Does that answer your question? No.
I was interested in you talking about the way that literature is being used by various other disciplines, medicine, business, and so on. One of the question I wanted to ask, my thesis was actually on using literature as a means of moral development in schools, and of course, empathy, etc. I couldn't have done that if I hadn't known about literature, and I hadn't also known about how the various ways in which moral development is characteristically taught in schools. When you talk about, and you're right, and this has been going on for some time, medical schools using literature, how are they using it? Are they specialized enough to be using it properly? Mm-hmm. What literature are they using? Isn't there a case here, maybe you've implicitly made it yourself, that if this kind of thing is going to be done with literature, it has to be done with people who know how to deal with literature, and then make the connection to the discipline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in part the joke from my ex-boyfriend about going to teach at a business school is really not a joke. It was really a kind of solid strategic plan, right? A backup plan. I think right now, at least, when I say we did this digital humanities project, it was a syllabus database that we created. And I think that there's something like over 12,000 syllabi from professional schools that use literature. And when we asked for the syllabi, some of them we collected just by looking at program websites, and some of them we emailed people to ask for. And when we emailed people, we also offered them a survey. We said, can you please take the survey? And we got, I'd say, about 75 survey responses. And one of the things we asked was, what is your background? How did you come to decide to teach literature in this professional context? And the answer that we got most often was that, the person doing it was not a literature professor, but they had either an MA or an MFA in English, or they had studied English, they had majored in English as an undergraduate, and then gone on to medical school. So they'd majored in English while they were also doing their pre-med requirements. And so it wasn't that they didn't have any knowledge, it's just that they generally had the knowledge of a very good undergraduate or of an MA student. And my question would be is that, and I think your question, right, is that enough? Is that enough to be teaching courses in these other kinds of professional settings? And the answer to that question is always linked to, well, what do you want the courses to do? So there's no kind of objective answer out there. And I don't think everyone needs to have a PhD in order to do this kind of teaching. But there is some credentialing going on, even if it's at a lower level of credentialing than what a professor of literature has. Well, yes, right. That would be the other way of getting it scale. But now you're asking me to make deals with the devil. So I'm joking. Yeah.
There was a question in the back. I saw your hand.
Thanks. So you both spoke so compellingly about professionalization, and the whole time I was sort of hearing this spectral other word that is also present, particularly in the titles of the two books that you invoked, which was professing. And I wonder if you've thought much about sort of the space between those two words, between professional and professor, and leads, insofar as I formulated a question, is professor still the right word for what you want to see this this vocation being?
Yeah, I thought you were going to say that the spectral word was teacher, which we didn't speak so much about. And my sense is that it's actually teaching that has a closer relationship to the production of criticism as I imagine it. And the reason I say that is because I think that when you teach, say, a seminar, and imagine you have 10, 12, 15 students all sitting around a table together. They all are holding actual physical copies of the same book, which increasingly is rare, and you are guiding them through a discussion. And this, at least the way I teach, right, I come to that seminar setting with an argument that I know I want to make about the book, but I don't want to make it explicitly. I want them to make it for me. And so the question becomes, how do I ask the right series of questions such that it evokes the right answers that then build up to the argument that I want to make in about 3 hours? That is actually not at all different from the way I think about writing a piece for the New Yorker or the New York Review of Books. It's just that I've kind of erased the questions and I've taken the answers and threaded them together in paragraph form to make an argument. So to me, there's a very close link between being a professor, by which I mean being a teacher, and being a critic. And that same link, at least for me, and I'm not saying it's not true for other people, but for me, that link doesn't exist to being a professor, by which I would mean being a scholar. I think that my scholarship is produced in a really different way from the way my criticism is produced. And one of the things I'm saying is that I think that criticism is pedagogical, that when you write a 3,500 or a 5,000 word piece, you're not just trying to tell someone, read this book or don't read this book. You're trying to say, let me present an object to you and show you how to understand it. And let me show you how your understanding of it can be both intensely pleasurable and can also produce a kind of knowledge in the world about how the object was made, about what its function is, about what its history is, or how it exists in history. So to the extent that professor is the absent term, I would say professor for me kind of breaks or schisms into teacher and scholar, and one of those identities sits much closer to criticism than the other. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
What are, for students who are doing this sort of minor in criticism, studying criticism, what are the modalities and criteria by which they're evaluated or examined?
I haven't actually set up the program yet, so this is
what
all
would
kind
your
of pie
ideal
in the
be?
sky.
How would that change how we evaluate students across the humanities?
Well, it depends. It depends, again, what genres we're talking about. So for instance, one of the people that I'm talking to, or who I want to hire, is someone who at other places teaches a course on how to produce a 40-minute episode, radio episode, not a podcast, which is slightly different, but a 40-minute broadcast, let's say, that takes a single cultural artifact, whether it is a painting or a shoe or a novel or a chair, and makes an argument about its function in the world. And it does that by drawing on archival evidence, interview evidence, by creating a kind of narrative through line, and by transforming argument into narrative with all these supplemental forms of evidence. I don't know how to evaluate that because I don't teach that class, but the person who is the expert in doing that, I think, has a very kind of clear understanding of what kinds of broadcasts do that effectively, and how you know when it has done it effectively, and how you know when it doesn't. The same way that I think I have an understanding of what it means for a work of criticism to be successful. And again, that's different from what it takes for, say, an argumentative essay written for an English class to be successful. So I think the first criterion of success for a work of criticism is that it has to get the reader from beginning to end. It has to entertain. It is in part a genre of entertainment. And I think it's very easy to kind of poo-poo entertainment, but why? Don't we all want to be entertained? Who wants to read something and be bored? Or if you want to be bored, you want to be bored for a purpose. You want to be able to make an argument about why it's important for this artifact to bore you. And that in and of itself is incredibly entertaining. So I think it does come back to wanting to get the person from beginning to end, right? That's a really different criterion from how we think about judging essays that we write for classes. I often feel like essays, and this is, one of the interesting things that I think all these AI developments and ChatGPT elements have made quite visible, is that we teach students how to write for argument. I think it's quite rare to encounter teachers who teach students how to write for style and to think about how to do that. I had a comp teacher when I was an undergraduate whose way of teaching this was he just sent me to the library to where all of Cynthia Ozik's books of criticism were. And he said, just write at the table in front of the Cynthia Ozik books, and you will kind of absorb style via osmosis. And that's not how we do it, right? That's not how it should be done. So the question of how you can take good examples of style and then define style and then teach students to read in order to learn the moves that they identify as markers of style, right, is another thing that we don't teach that we absolutely should. So like I said, I mean, I apologize for punting your question a little bit, but because it's so genre dependent, and because it's even so subgenre dependent, I can't give you a kind of overall scheme. And I would kind of turn the question and say, I wonder how many of the kind of rubrics that one gets for grading an analytic essay hold up under pressure or under questioning.
I think there was one more question,
okay.
and yeah, great.
Thank you. Thanks. This is super interesting. So I live here now, but I'm just finishing up my job in California, which is as the head of a statewide nonprofit called California Humanities.
Oh, great.
Focus with one of the 55 state and territorial humanities councils that are funded partly by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And our focus is on the public humanities, right? So if we say the academic disciplines are here, the spectrum of the public humanities is, here's a family talking about their history, culture, traditions over the dinner table and everything in between. And we work really hard to make sure that we're democratizing the humanities. And so I'm curious about your opinion of the future of that kind of intersectionality between the public and the academic. What if there was a seamlessness between community and the academy?
Well, I mean, that's precisely or one of the things I think that the center is thinking about. But I would maybe say, and this is not at all to antagonize you, that I have a slight allergy to the way that the term public gets used in these contexts. And you see this increasingly in academia, right? That one of the, I think, panicked responses to the crisis of the job market for graduate students is to say, okay, we're going to teach public writing, or we're going to teach public humanities. And that simply doesn't exist, right? As you said, when you think about this continuum between the dinner table and the academy and everything in between, I think you really have to think very specifically about the everything. I'm not saying you're not doing it. I'm just saying that the version of it that I see in academia is saying there's something called public writing, and that's what we teach. But of course, there are many, many different kinds of publics, and they are brought into being through many different mechanisms of circulation and of address. And here I'm just riffing on a great book by Michael Warner called Publics and Counterpublics, which I encourage everybody to read. And part of what one needs to do in order to address a public is understand how it's made up, who is in it. And what that very often has to do with, in say the magazine world, is circulation, right? Who reads the New Yorker versus who reads the Nation versus who reads the New York Review of Books versus who reads Dissent versus who reads N+1. All of those magazines have different publics, and as such, they have different conventions of address. A dinner table has a different convention of address than a library, which has a different convention of address from a prison literacy initiative or a micro college or an elementary school or a radio broadcast. And I think that the first thing we need to do in order for that seamless connection to exist is to actually identify the publics for whom it can exist and for whom it should exist. And instead of having this kind of amorphous and I think largely administrative facing category called the public humanities or public writing, what we need to do is figure out what skills are being taught at what levels of the education system that can move between different publics. I was recently giving a talk at Notre Dame, and a professor there described this very compellingly as teaching code switching between different publics. And to me, that's a really nice way of putting it, because that's actually something you can teach. Whereas this kind of amorphous and weird category of public writing is simply not something that can be taught. And you're kind of cutting your own 2 feet out from under you before you've even started the project. So I hope that that's partially an answer, which is just to say, like, we need better ways of mapping publics in order to learn how to address them from different locations, whether that is from the dinner table or from the academy.